The Saint Germain file. There are cases in history that refuse to close. Folders that accumulate dust in archives, filled with testimonies that contradict the natural order of time itself. This is one of them. The name in the file is Saint Germain. No first name. No confirmed birthplace. No verifiable death. What we have instead are letters, memoirs, court records, and newspaper reports spanning nearly a century, all describing the same man who, according to dozens of witnesses, never aged. This is not folklore. This is documented testimony from kings, philosophers, diplomats, and aristocrats who swore they saw him across decades, unchanged, as if time had agreed to leave him alone. We begin in the candlelit halls of Versailles, where the first entries in this dossier were written by people who had no reason to lie. The year is 1733. Paris. A man appears in the salons of the French aristocracy. He calls himself the Count of Saint-Germain. He speaks perfect French, but his accent is unplaceable. He wears diamonds that would bankrupt a prince, yet no one knows where his fortune came from. He has no title that can be verified, no family crest that matches any known lineage, and no official records of birth. He is, by all accounts, approximately 40 years old. The problem begins here. Not with what was recorded, but with what was missing. No baptismal record. No parents. No childhood. No country of origin that anyone could confirm. When asked directly about his past, he deflected with charm, with cryptic remarks, with carefully chosen silence. The French court accepted him because he was useful. He spoke 8 languages fluently, composed music for the royal household, and demonstrated knowledge of chemistry that impressed the king's own scientists. He was charming, intelligent, and wealthy. In an era where identity was currency, he spent it without ever revealing the source. But the mystery was not his arrival. It was what happened over the next 50 years. By 1748, Saint-Germain had become a fixture at the court of King Louis XV. He moved through the highest circles of European power, advising monarchs, brokering diplomatic missions, and performing what he called alchemical experiments in private chambers. And he still looked 40 years old. 15 years had passed since his first appearance in Paris. The people who had met him in the 1730s were now older, graying, marked by time. Saint-Germain was not. The first written observations come from those closest to the king. Courtiers began to note, in private correspondence, that the count had not changed. Not his face, not his energy, not the color of his hair. In an age before photography, these descriptions are all we have, but they are numerous, consistent, and troubling. One servant at Versailles wrote in a letter preserved in the French National Archives that Saint-Germain appeared as if painted by the same hand, year after year, while we all grew old around him. This was not myth. This was observation. Chapter 3, Madame de Pompadour. Jean-Antoinette Poisson, known as Madame de Pompadour, was the king's chief mistress and one of the most powerful women in France. She was educated, skeptical, and meticulous in her documentation of court life. Her memoirs, published after her death, include multiple references to Saint-Germain. She wrote that he claimed to be 300 years old and spoke of historical events as if he had witnessed them firsthand. She noted that he never ate food at dinners, only sipping occasionally from a glass. And she recorded, in her own hand, that he looked the same in 1760 as he had in 1748. Madame de Pompadour was not a gossip. She was an administrator, a patron of the arts, and a political operator. Her testimony carries weight because she had no incentive to fabricate. She was documenting what she saw, and what she saw defied the passage of time. In one entry, she describes a conversation in which Saint Germain referenced the court of King Francis I, who had died 200 years earlier, as if he had been present. When challenged, he smiled, and changed the subject. Chapter 4, Voltaire's letter. François-Marie Rouet, known as Voltaire, was one of the most famous intellectuals of the 18th century. He was a philosopher, a satirist, and a relentless skeptic of superstition and fraud. He did not believe in miracles, alchemy, or anything that could not be explained by reason. And yet, in a letter dated 1760, Voltaire wrote to a friend about Saint Germain. He called him a man who never dies and who knows everything. This is not a casual observation. Voltaire was precise with language. He would not have written those words unless something about Saint Germain disturbed his rational worldview. The letter, preserved in Voltaire's collected correspondence, suggests that even a man dedicated to exposing charlatans could not explain the count. Voltaire did not claim Saint Germain was immortal. He claimed he did not die. The distinction is important. One is fantasy. The other is an unresolved question. Saint Germain spoke at least 8 languages fluently, according to multiple sources. French, German, English, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, and several dialects of Arabic. But witnesses noted something stranger than fluency. They noted the absence of accent. A French diplomat wrote in his journal that Saint Germain spoke German as a native of Berlin, Italian as if born in Rome, and English with the precision of an Oxford scholar. No single person, even in an era of educated polyglots, could achieve this level of mastery across so many languages unless they had lived in each region for years. When questioned about his linguistic ability, Saint Germain responded that he had traveled extensively. But no records exist of his travels. No ship manifests, no border crossings, no visas, or letters of introduction. He appeared in courts across Europe as if materializing, already fluent, already informed. He also spoke of historical events with a specificity that unnerved his listeners. A Russian countess recorded in her diary that Saint Germain described the assassination of Henry IV in 1610 with such detail that she felt he must have read every account ever written. When she asked him where he had studied the event, he replied, "I was there." She assumed he was joking. But his face, she wrote, did not suggest humor. Dozens of witnesses, across multiple decades, recorded the same observation. Saint Germain did not eat. At banquets held by the king, at dinners hosted by foreign ambassadors, at private gatherings of the aristocracy, he sat at tables filled with food and touched none of it. He drank wine occasionally, or fruit juices prepared in his own residence, but he never consumed solid food in public. A Prussian minister wrote in a letter to Frederick the Great that he had dined with Saint Germain on 3 separate occasions and never once saw him eat. He noted this not as gossip, but as a curiosity worth reporting to his monarch. In the 18th century, eating was a social and political act. Refusing food was unusual. Doing so for decades, in front of hundreds of people, was unheard of. Yet no one could force him to explain. He was a count, a guest, a man of independent means. He owed no explanation. But the question remained. What does a man subsist on if not food? Saint-Germain claimed to possess knowledge of alchemy. Not the fantasy of turning lead into gold, but the refinement of metals and the purification of gemstones. And witnesses reported that he demonstrated this knowledge in controlled settings. A French jeweler named Gaston de Levis documented an event in which Saint-Germain took a flawed diamond and, through a process involving heat and chemical solutions, removed the imperfections. The jeweler examined the stone afterward and confirmed the transformation. He could not explain how it was done. Another report comes from a German prince who witnessed Saint-Germain mix mercury with an unknown powder and produce a substance that resembled gold. The prince had the substance tested by his court chemist, who confirmed it contained gold, but could not determine whether it had been transmuted or merely refined from impure ore. These accounts are not proof of alchemy, but they are proof that Saint-Germain possessed technical knowledge beyond what was common in his era. And that knowledge, combined with his refusal to age, created a profile that could not be easily dismissed. By 1770, Saint-Germain had been a public figure for nearly 40 years. The people who had first met him in the 1730s were now elderly or dead. He was not. Court records, letters, and memoirs from this period describe him as vigorous, sharp-minded, and physically unchanged. A Swedish count wrote in his diary that Saint-Germain, whom he had met in 1745, looked identical in 1772. 27 years. No gray hair. No wrinkles. No signs of aging. If we accept the earliest credible sighting in 1733, and assume he was 40 years old at that time, then by 1770 he should have been 77. He was not described as 77. He was described as 40. The mathematics do not resolve. Either the witnesses were wrong, or something interrupted the normal progression of time on his body. In 1776, Saint-Germain left France and relocated to Germany. He settled in the court of Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel, where he lived for the remainder of his documented life. The prince was a Freemason, a patron of esoteric studies, and a man drawn to mysteries. Saint-Germain continued his alchemical work under the prince's protection. He also continued to meet visitors, diplomats, and scholars, all of whom left written records of their encounters. One visitor, a Danish nobleman, wrote that Saint-Germain in 1780 looked no different than descriptions written 50 years earlier. He noted this with confusion, not awe. He could not understand how a man in his 90s could appear middle-aged. On February 27, 1784, official records state that the Count of Saint-Germain died at the residence of Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel in Eckernford, Germany. A death certificate was issued. A burial was recorded. The case, according to history, was closed. But the file was not. In 1793, 9 years after his recorded death, a woman claiming to be close to Marie Antoinette wrote that the Queen had met with Saint-Germain in the Tuileries Palace shortly before her arrest. The account states that he warned her of the coming revolution and urged her to flee. She did not. If true, This places Saint-Germain in Paris 9 years after his death certificate was signed in Germany. Other sightings followed. A man matching his description, using the same name, was reported in Vienna in 1822. In Venice in 1848. In Paris again in 1867. Each time, witnesses described him as middle-aged, well-dressed, speaking multiple languages fluently, and claiming to be the Count of Saint-Germain. These reports cannot be verified. But they also cannot be dismissed without explanation. Either multiple impostors adopted his identity across a century, or the death certificate in 1784 was incomplete. If we approach this as an investigation, two primary hypotheses emerge. The first, Saint-Germain was not one man, but a carefully maintained identity passed between individuals who resembled each other. This would explain the lack of aging, the sudden appearances in different cities, and the post-mortem sightings. It would require coordination, wealth, and motive. But it is possible. The second, Saint-Germain faked his death in 1784, or the death recorded was of someone else. This would explain the continued sightings and the consistency of appearance. It would require influence, resources, and a reason to disappear from official records while remaining visible in society. Neither hypothesis involves immortality. Both involve deception. But deception of this scale, maintained across decades, by a man with no verifiable origin, raises its own questions. The file on the Count of Saint-Germain remains open. Not because we lack evidence of his death, but because the evidence of his life does not align with the laws that govern mortality. Dozens of credible witnesses, across 50 years, described the same man who did not age. Philosophers, diplomats, kings, and servants all recorded the same anomaly. And after his death was officially recorded, his face continued to appear. History records that he died. But history also records that he was seen afterward, unchanged, as if time had simply refused to claim him. The candles in the archives burn low. The letters remain. The testimonies endure. And the question, written in fading ink across 2 centuries, remains unanswered. Did the Count of Saint-Germain die in 1784, or did he simply close the chapter the world was allowed to read? The file stays open.